Deal first of all with the balloon motion. Is this motion still up in the air, or are we going to land it? Who would like to move it?
Invite the Minister of National Defence, the Honourable Anita Anand, and the Deputy Commander of NORAD, Lieutenant General Alain Peltier, to provide a briefing of no fewer than 2 hours concerning the foreign airship from the People's Republic of China that recently violated Canadian airspace, and that the briefing be held in public within the next 4 days.
Do we have any excessive debate?
I'd like to make a sub-amendment.
Okay.
Sorry, an amendment. That reads that the Standing Committee on National Defence invite the Minister of National Defence, Honourable Anita Anand, to appear prior to March 11th, 2023, and that the Deputy Commander of NORAD, Lieutenant General Alain Peltier, and the Commander of the RCAF, Lieutenant General Eric Kenny, appear within the next week to provide a briefing of no fewer than 2 hours concerning the foreign airship from the People's Republic of China that recently violated Canadian airspace, and that the briefing be held in public.
Do you speaking to the amendment?
I have an additional amendment, but we can speak to the amendment. So in turn, we agree with wanting to obviously host these meetings. The only language I would add to the attendees of officials is a line that says all other appropriate officials. Relevant officials, yeah, that would be fine. We are fine with the 11th date, but I just, in terms of trying to keep this clean, we'd prefer as soon as possible, but that would be up for debate. And then the other slight change that I would make would be changing the name of the object to high altitude surveillance balloon, which is sort of what the common language is for this.
Okay. I guess we're not going to land this balloon anytime soon. See whether we can go through these things backwards and see whether we've got consensus back and forth on. So the last one you moved was high altitude surveillance balloon. Correct. We agree, don't I? Yeah. Okay.
Chair, we accept the friendly amendments.
All three? Okay.
Yes.
All three. So we're now. Let's see. We've accepted that. Now, has the other side accepted Shelby's amendment to Cheryl's original motion?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
As amended.
Okay. As amended. And so, therefore, we have a clean motion. Mr. Clerk, do we have a clean motion at this point?
More or less, yeah.
More or less? Okay.
Which one is it? More or less?
Yeah. We're going with more. We're going to go with more. Okay, with that, we all know what we're voting on. Those in favor of the motion as amended and as amended and as amended? I'm assuming here, yes. Opposed? Seeing none? Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. I won't make any more lame jokes about landing this balloon. All right. So with that, we can now turn to the main business of the meeting, and we have with us two witnesses. The first is Kristen Kesenke.
No, other way around.
Sorry. Oh, I apologize.
It's okay.
It's okay. Dr. Thomas Keenan, Professor, University of Calgary. Welcome, sir. And,
thank you very much. Good morning.
And Alex Rudolph from Carleton University, PhD candidate. I think since Professor Keenan has got up earliest in order to be able to give this testimony, we should defer to him. So, sir, you have 5 minutes, and welcome to the committee.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, distinguished committee members, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me today. I'd like to speak to you about a subject that I've been studying for years as a researcher, University of Calgary professor, and a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, artificial intelligence. I believe it's going to revolutionize everything, including cybersecurity and cyber warfare, and a lot quicker than most people expected. AI is all over the news now, right now, because of things like ChatGPT. But I was teaching it 30 years ago. Many of my students who built back propagation neural networks then have gone on to do great things. Artificial intelligence now does everything from detecting tiny tumors on MRIs to helping cities optimize traffic signals. But there is a dark side to artificial intelligence, something we call adversarial AI. My fear is, like so many industries, our defense folks will embrace AI without fully understanding how it can be used against us. Now, you probably heard about those Snoopy information kiosks in Cadillac Fairview shopping malls. The company was chastised by the privacy commissioner for secretly collecting data on 5 million people, including their approximate age and gender. But how did they know your gender? They made an educated guess using AI and facial recognition. For 25 years, I ran a program for highly gifted high school students called Shad Valley Calgary. It culminated in a science fair where they showed off their work. One year, they built a neural network to predict your gender from body measurements like hip to waist ratio. One corporate sponsor stopped at their booth, and yes, he was rather portly. They measured him, and they told him that with 84% probability, he was female. But that was actually a good thing, because those students realized that AI is just making informed guesses. If you go to ChatGPT or similar programs, they will give you answers that don't have any percentages or degrees of uncertainty. They read like statements of fact, and they can be dead wrong. I asked ChatGPT, is Danielle Smith intelligent? And it came back with, I cannot accurately determine who you are referring to as Danielle Smith. It does say that Justin Trudeau is widely considered to be intelligent. What's going on here? Well, I lifted the hood on the current free public version of ChatGPT, and its knowledge base ends at 2021. At that time, Danielle Smith was an unemployed talk radio host. She didn't rise to her current political prominence until 2022. I'm sure that ChatGPT's database will be updated and its answer will be different in the future. That's another problem. You can ask an AI bot the same question twice and get wildly different answers, and it doesn't tell you why. Now, don't get me wrong, I love AI and its potential upside. There are plenty of companies that will tell you all about that since they have products to push. My mission is to make sure we look at the risks and apply this tool intelligently. Here are 3 things to worry about as AI moves into national defense. The source of training data. Most AI is trained on public domain data, which might be inadequate. We've seen issues with facial recognition having trouble recognizing people of color because it was exposed mainly to white faces. In the defense industry, much of the most important data is not in the public domain. 2, the lack of ethics in AI. We all remember Tay, the Microsoft chatbot that went off the rails and started spouting Nazi ideas, foul language, and referred to feminism as a cult. Tay was just learning from the people who interacted with it, and unfortunately, that's what it talked about. 3, malicious actors can try to poison the database. A woman has been trying to rewrite the Wikipedia entry on Nazis to paint them in a favorable light. Way back in 2003, Democratic supporters linked the term miserable failure on Google to George W. Bush's official White House biography. So when you did a Google search for miserable failure, up came the president's picture. Now, if you don't want your political profile to be linked to miserable failure or worse, you should heed what ChatGPT has to say about this very committee. The Standing Committee on National Defense Within the House of Commons, its power immense, a place where decisions are made with care for the safety and security of all to share. With members from every party, they convene to review and assess and to make things clean. Wait a minute, to make things clean? What does that even mean? Only ChatGPT knows for sure, and it's not telling. Thank you very much.
Professor Keene, we don't generally get poetry about our our own committee. Yeah, but it's not nearly as good as that. And I don't think we should be putting to votes the intelligence of either political persons mentioned, including the present company. I noticed you have a very interesting map behind you, submarine cables of the world. That in,
Yes,
and,
sir.
of that in and of itself is a pretty interesting discussion, but on to our next witness. Mr. Rudolph, you have 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, members, thank you for inviting me to speak here today. I am Alexander Rudolph. I'm a doctoral candidate at Carleton University, and I am Canadian Global Affairs Institute's fellow, where I research how and why countries develop the institutional means to conduct cyber operations. And as part of this research, I look extensively at Canada. On this, I will divide my comments between two themes today: the cyber threat domain and current trends in cyber conflict, and Canadian cyber defense. The cyber threat domain can best be described as existing in a perpetual state of conflict and tension. This is a result of its longstanding architecture that, although has been improved over the years, is still very much present and can produce vulnerabilities and exploits. And these vulnerabilities and exploits is ultimately what forms the basis to malware and cyber operations that we view as cyber conflicts or cyber warfare. And with this, there are, I would say, a few major trends right now to keep in mind. The first is that no norms or international laws currently exist to address cyber conflict and cyber warfare. To be clear, this is not the stance of Canada and many NATO allies, but presently there is no international regime or consensus about how to address international law and cyber conflict. Second is ransomware has completely revolutionized how adversarial states and non-state actors view cyberspace. As an example, North Korea has been very prolific in using cyber operations, particularly ransomware, to fund ways to evade international sanctions. But this also overlooks how Russia and many other actors use it, ransomware and cyber operations as well. There's also the commodification of 0 days. 0 days are unknown vulnerabilities in a system, a computer, or a piece of software. The proliferation of these 0 days and exploits have significantly contributed to the proliferation of cyber capabilities and the ability to conduct cyber operations. In particular, China mandates that all new vulnerabilities, 0 days, to be reported to the government within 2 days. This is the first type of law of its kind that tends to go against existing norms in the industry that has generally favored maximum protection of users as possible. And I would be remiss to not mention Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and its utilization of cyber operations in near simultaneous kinetic joint military operations. I want to echo the comments made at the previous meeting, but also want to highlight the type of operations that have been most numerous. While the Viasat attack is quite noteworthy, there's also been at least 16 wiper malwares deployed into Ukraine to specifically target Ukraine to date. Wiper malware are viruses that will destroy data completely and as a means to prevent recovery. This is novel because it is not what most criminals will do and most those that are after to make money, because the way they gain their money is by holding this data and holding it ransom to extort individuals. And so wiper malware has the sole intention of destroying data in systems. And it's noteworthy that 16 have been deployed, which is more than there have been in the past 20 years. So now I'll move on to Canadian cyber defense and what all of these trends mean for Canada. In particular, Canada needs both a whole of government cybersecurity response, but also a very targeted cyber defense response. And the cyber defense in particular includes CSC and the Canadian Armed Forces. But today I'm going to focus on the Canadian Armed Forces. The CAF is in no way prepared to face cyber warfare in the event of a conflict. And I further question to what degree they are able to even cooperate and work interchangeably with allies, including the United States. The reasons for such are numerous, but I'll go over a few today. At best, Canadian cyber defense policy can be described as incomplete, ad hoc, and inconsistent in strategy and definition. In definition with Canada's allies, particularly the United States. By definition, I use CSC's definition of defensive cyber operation as an example. And the way that CSC and Canada uses it, it generally refers to a purpose to attack back or respond to an active threat on Canada. This isn't traditionally how defensive cyber operations are discussed or explained, where they're generally not about an active response back. And while this is maybe just legal language, it creates a difficult creates difficulty in speaking with allies on the exact same topic when you're talking about defensive cyber operations, which are traditionally just on one's own networks, similar to cybersecurity in many ways. But if you're talking about offensive actions, it is a big disconnect between thinkers in Canada and allies on how cyber operations are conducted and understood.
Mr. Rudolph, I think I'm going to have to ask you to get the balance of your presentation in with the questions because you're past the 5-minute mark. So I apologize for that, but it is what it is. With that, Madame Gallant, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. The first one would be to Dr. Keenan. Should there be an open discussion, an agreement in Parliament outlining the limits of use of AI for the military?
Yes, I believe there should be. Now, there is a policy on the responsible use of AI up at the Canada.ca website. I read it. And it's fine, except it's dated 2021. So the first point I want to make is that you have to do this continuously. You can't, it's not one and done. And so there definitely should be a policy. I've consulted with my friends in industry, particularly Microsoft, because they've put many millions of dollars into ChatGPT, and there are moves to ethical AI. So my suggestion would be, yes, that should be done. It should be done in consultation with industry and with academia.
And how should Parliament balance the safeguards from the dark side while encouraging the positive discoveries? How do we see that balance?
That's the million-dollar question. We don't have the Nobel Prize if we knew that. The answer is to keep track. And I'm going to give you one little example. Google has a search engine. We all know about it. And someone was able to find out the name of a young offender whose name was protected by a publication ban in an Ontario case by using Google. And the way it worked is that so many people said, Johnny Smith is a bad boy. And they Googled Johnny Smith and this heinous crime that happened. And Google formed that association. And when they were asked about that, Google said, we didn't do it because, none of us did this. We didn't break the publication ban. But their algorithm did. The point of that story is that you have to keep watching. You have to keep looking for examples like that. And that was several years ago. I don't know that Google has actually done anything, you might ask them, to cover themselves when they potentially break a publication ban that's ordered by a judge. So it's continued vigilance.
So for Mr. Rudolph, how does Russia use malware, ransomware during kinetic ops versus just for blackmail and money?
I'll use you one example from just recent invasion. They deployed what looked like to be a ransomware, which was encrypting the system and saying that your system is now locked down and your data encrypted. You now need to pay us X amount. But on behind it, they were actually deploying a wiper malware to destroy all the data. So it's always a case-by-case basis where Russia in particular uses it as to target in specific systems and organizations during their invasion, while traditionally it's been used with the intelligence services in various ways to extort money.
And at what point should a company get in touch, or the private sector get in touch with somebody from government, the military, and when should the military be alerted that they've got to harden their cybersecurity even more because there's an attack underway, and then link it to the possibility that it's just the beginning of an escalation for a kinetic interaction?
It's always quite difficult to determine if it will lead to a kinetic response, as cyber operations can be escalatory. So it's oftentimes how it is combined with other efforts. So a cyber operation itself is not necessarily going to cause kinetic damage, but how states respond or use that operation in unison with kinetic operations is the great concern, which is what Russia has attempted to do in Ukraine.
So we have a new cybersecurity bill that's being proposed, but it's more headed towards this, or geared towards civilians. Should there be another cybersecurity bill specifically to address your concerns for the military, and or should it dovetail with the civilian cybersecurity? And at what point does a civilian attack actually interface with military infrastructure, and how can that happen, and has it happened?
In Canada, I can't comment if it has happened or not, as you need to ask the military on if there has been any attacks on military infrastructure. But it's often difficult to determine, like with many critical infrastructure, much of it is dual use. So if it is targeting explicitly military infrastructure, I would consider that an attack on the military. But I would say there needs to be another bill to address cyber defense in the armed forces and CSC. Particularly, there needs to be a formal force and command structure that organizes CSC and the military, as it currently doesn't exist. It's very ad hoc.
Thank you, Mr. Rudolph.
Thank you, Ms. Blunt. Mr. Fisher, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. When the Rogers system went down, I was on the way to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia for work meetings, and it basically shut down all our critical infrastructure. You couldn't get gas, you couldn't go to an ATM machine, nothing was working. And then I think about in Atlantic, Canada, when Fiona hit, you couldn't, gone are the days of having a newspaper on your doorstep, but you couldn't get news, you couldn't pay a bill, you couldn't do anything when our critical infrastructure went down because of Fiona. And I highlight those two examples essentially just to show the reliance on our critical infrastructure. How important it is to everybody in every neighborhood across the country and around the world. And I guess I'll go to you, Mr. Rudolph, first. How can the federal government, along with provinces and territories, better protect and defend this critical infrastructure that is so absolutely necessary in the lives of Canadians?
Well, it's quite a big question, but I will first state that there needs to be a lot more funding to the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity and ways for the center to interface with the rest of the government and the government to look to what the provinces need and what the federal government needs, as they are very different, diverse needs that are needed on both to provide services, as you mentioned, but also protecting the government from threats, as the holistic cybersecurity kind of response that I mentioned before, that would cover aspects of critical infrastructure that are needed. But it is, with the Canadian Armed Forces, they are still very much reliant upon many public systems as well, in part because their internal systems are very insufficient that they need. So there is just flatly a need for greater funding and a need to address how to respond to bigger incidents like that and what role the Canadian Center of Cybersecurity has in these, similar to how the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency in the United States does.
When we think about emerging technologies, things that Canadians adopt on a mass scale, like cell phones and things like that, which trends represent the greatest cybersecurity risks? You know, what initiatives also could the federal government undertake to mitigate these risks? So when you're thinking about smartphones and thinking about things like that.
The use of ransomware, I'd say, affects the phones just as much as our regular computers as well. And particularly with the proliferation of surveillance software, as many have probably heard of Pegasus or NSO group, that the greater proliferation of the 0 days and malware has made any piece of technology a target for potential profits or targeting by adversarial states. So this is part of the constant tension that I referred to, and part of the responsibility of the government is to face these threats and to address the criminals by working with allies to arrest and target some of the ransomware actors that were named, I believe it was yesterday or the day before. But Canada is, I would say, currently a low-level player in this. They are helping. CSE is well regarded around the world, but the Canadian Armed Forces can do more, but simply can't. And there are many other initiatives across the government that could look to what they are really contributing to their own department, cybersecurity, and the constituents that they're helping.
You want to jump in on this?
Were you inviting me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, well, yes. First of all, I wanted to discuss something I call the ransomware from hell. It's a scenario that I made, and I think it needs to be aired here. So let's say you're the hospital administrator, and you get an email, and it says, one of your employees just clicked on that phishing email from a Saudi prince, and now we're inside your system. But we are not going to hold your data for ransom or erase it. We have a much better idea. We've traversed your network. We know that you have 75 Picker X-ray units, 4 Siemens MRIs, 2,000 BD infusion pumps, and they all have vulnerabilities. There are 0-day vulnerabilities in many technologies that the manufacturers don't know about, but they're for sale on the dark web. And hey, we bought this on the dark web, and we need to get our money back, so you have to pay us $10 million in Bitcoin by tomorrow. If you don't, we're not going to encrypt your data. That's so old school. We're just going to kill a patient every day. And I did look up an article from Israel, 7 ways to kill a patient with a Picker X-ray unit, from hitting them physically with it to giving them too much radiation. So the reality is I took this to a bunch of hospital administrators in the US, and they either said, we pay the ransom, and I said, okay, great. They'll be back for $20 million tomorrow. We'd ignore it. Okay, well, then you'll be on the front page of the New York Times. Hospital kills grandma by refusing to pay ransom. Or we tried to air gap it. So this is where we get technical. We say, well, we'll separate all the different hospital systems so they can't do this. My medical colleagues say that's nonsense because that picker x-ray unit has to talk to the doctor in the lab computer and the intraoperative MRI. My point is it's a tightly connected network. The answer is, and I've taken this to everybody I know who's smart, there is no answer.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. There is no answer. Mr. Gagnon, bienvenue au comité. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
6 minutes, Mr. Gagnon. Thank you very much, Chair. First, I have a question for you, Dr. Rudolph. We've recently learned that the federal government has been dealing extensively with private firms, of course, McKinsey, there are others, in various departments that are very sensitive, defense, immigration, and we've learned that many of these firms, including McKinsey, have been dealing themselves with other firms or affiliates controlled by the Chinese government. Do you think that we should pay any particular attention to this issue, risk, if you will, and be very conscious of which firms we're dealing with and who they are dealing with? Or do you think that within the defense establishment, for example, large contracts are let with these organizations?
It is, I would agree that it is a major risk, particularly with, don't recall the name of the communications company that was recently suspended because of ties to Chinese firms. I'd say that is a constant ongoing problem, as we have seen evidence that China will actively taint supply chains to try to implant surveillance capabilities. The most recent one, I believe almost a full fleet of cars in the UK were found to be bugged through this manner. But at the same time, with certain other firms, I would want to parse the different risks between, say, large consulting firms and those in the supply chain as two completely different risks there. As in cyber defense and cybersecurity, McKinsey and these large consulting firms are really the big names in the business that will be doing all these, much of this business. So there really is no getting around them. And they, when you are taking into account massive inflation and the massive competition to get these skilled individuals, you can't necessarily compete with them.
Si vous me permettez, puisque vous dites que...
If you allow, some of these firms, as you say, the big five, many of these are unavoidable. We have to use them. Would it not be preferable that the Canadian government adopt a regime of selection, a more effective qualification regime? When you see the Canadian government doing business with these, we need to know what information has been shared or what information they had access to. Because China uses all means possible to conduct a cyber war and cyber surveillance. So don't you think that we should insist more on transparency so that Canadians would be less frightened of this situation?
I will completely agree that there is a need for more transparency, I'd say across the board, on Canadian cyber defense policy, as most of my research is from looking at audits and looking at departmental results, and then being surprised that people are surprised at what I know about the Canadian Armed Forces. But as much as I know broad themes, there is still a lot of gaps in my knowledge, and that's simply because the Canadian Armed Forces doesn't want to tell you, and because they are prevented from doing so. So it's very much a policy problem. But I would really want to stress that there is a difference between the transparency and putting more demands on the big five or these firms, because there's already quite a few demands.
Vous avez dit quelque chose d'intéressant.
Oh, yeah, there's an interesting comment you've just made there. As a researcher, the lack of transparency in the Department of Defense, for example, is quite endemic. and it would hinder researchers to conduct research on the matter. Is that a fair interpretation of what you said?
I would agree. It's endemic to the system as recently the National Security Intelligence Review Agency found there were 180 independent databases in the Canadian Armed Forces, meaning that you need personnel management, not information management, in order to access much of this data.
Peut-être une question en terminant.
Perhaps a final question for now to Professor Keenan. We know that social media play a very important role with AI and surveillance. People, Quebecois, Canadians, will offer their information without really knowing what they're dealing with. There's surveillance capitalism going. All this information feeds these algorithms, and it may run counter to an individual's interest. Is there any way we can better protect Canadian citizens' data so that we can improve our digital identity? Because once you lose your identity, it's impossible to recapture.
To answer that good question, so if you could be very brief, please.
Okay, so thank you so much for mentioning Shoshana Zuboff's idea of surveillance capitalism. My son is actually a cybersecurity researcher who worked with her on that book. There is no question that we give up too much information on social media. There is a wonderful video on The Onion, a satire site, where Mark Zuckerberg is honored as CIA Agent of the Year because he got people to give up so much information about themselves, where they're going to go, what events they will attend. So if you want to arrest them, you just look at their schedule. Absolutely, we need a greater awareness. And, there's a reality there that people love sharing information. It's not necessarily a good thing. At the very least, everyone needs to look at who gets access to their information. Is it you, your friends, the friends of your friends, or the whole world?
Thank you, Mr. Garrell. Mr. Boulderais, welcome to the committee. 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. My first question will go to Mr. Keenan. I appreciated when you referred AI systems being fed by prejudices, ideological stances, and that can integrate it into an educational system. The possibility of poisoning, I'll let you get your headset back on, to poison a database by changing the tone of a conversation. We could use AI to create false accounts on social media, which would change the conversation entirely, and then contaminate and further taint other AI systems using those same databases for their curricula, for example. So one AI would taint another AI system. It gets pretty complicated.
Oh.
You're on mute. Dr. Keenan, you're on mute.
That was my headset that muted me. It apologizes. I want to mention I have a wonderful graduate student, Anika Kale, who has been studying intelligence curricula around the world, and particularly from the point of view of gender. And she finds there's almost no awareness of gender in there. So, you're absolutely right. One source can pollute another source, and there's really no control on that. The best thing to know about this is AI generally doesn't explain itself. It gives you an answer. And my big objection to ChatGPT is it makes that answer look very authoritative when, it's just making it up out of nowhere. I did get it to write a poem once, and it put a disclaimer at the bottom, which I thought was very interesting. It said, "This is a creative work. It doesn't really have any facts in it." So you're absolutely right. One data source can poison another data source, and I have no doubt that intelligence agencies around the world are busy trying to poison our wells of open source data right now.
Et une question complémentaire, M. Keenan, sur un peu.
Supplementary question, Mr. Keenan. Same issue. As a parliamentarian, as an elected official, would the use of malware in the AI and social media represent a risk to our democracy by assisting and promoting a populist type of regime.
There's no question that we've seen this in U.S. presidential campaigns and other campaigns that bots are created for the explicit purpose of getting people riled up. And sometimes they'll do both sides. They'll do the left and the right. And the reason is they just want to sow discord in the United States. And you can probably think of what countries are doing this. I want to mention that, because there was mention of technology before and where are the risks. The American military tried an e-voting project where soldiers who were posted overseas could actually e-vote. And I was asked to comment on the security of the system. It was great because you had to do a video selfie of yourself and you really proved who you were. But some of those soldiers had cell phones that were made by Huawei, Xiaomi, Meizu. So here you have the endpoint, the cell phone that could be vulnerable. And it's the weakest link theory. That could be the way in which the e-voting system might have been corrupted.
Très intéressant. Merci beaucoup.
Very interesting. Thank you. Mr. Rudolph, in concerns to cyber attacks on our infrastructure, I recall in the 90s, so we couldn't take pictures of a hydropower dam because it was considered essential infrastructure, and we wanted to contain that information. Now, today, when we talk about cyber attacks on essential infrastructure in Canada, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, I would say I want to first take your example of being unable to take pictures as a security issue. We're now dealing with the greater proliferation of open source intelligence where you're able to use just Google Maps to conduct that same exact intelligence and analysis that 20 years ago was illegal to do in the first place. And using this kind of open source intelligence can also feed into operations on critical infrastructure because it is often the individuals, the people that are the draw or the vulnerability into a system. As any organization will have professionals to watch this, to work on cybersecurity. So you look for any weak link into a system. It can be any small thing that if they can gain entry, they will attempt to lock it down and use it for whatever means they have. If it is a state, they'll just lie in wait for a conflict to happen to then initiate it. If it is a criminal, usually it'll involve locking down the systems, preventing its use, such as the Colonial Pipeline attack, and demanding money. And if they don't get that ransom, they'll publish that data online, no matter how secret or sensitive that data is.
Thank you, Mr. Bulleris. Colleagues, we've got a little more than 15 minutes, and we've got 25 minutes worth of questions in the second round. The math doesn't work, so I'm going to unfortunately have to take a minute off everybody's line of questioning, starting with Ms. Newman, Newman.
Thank you. First of all, Dr. Keenan, Alex Rudolph, thank you for your testimony today. Mr. Rudolph, your comments with regards to being no way prepared to face cyber warfare is extremely concerning. So I'm going to start by referencing an article from 2021 from the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, where you highlighted the importance and necessity of the CAF to create and operate an effective cybersecurity force, and indicated that if the CAF cannot fulfill its cybersecurity needs, it may need to rely on the CSE. So in April of that same year, the CAF released a report titled Evaluation of Cyber Forces, in which they highlighted several concerns with regards to the CAF and what they had in retention and recruitment. What sort of problems would this cause, particularly having civilians taking on the role that would otherwise be filled by armed force members?
So as the CSE official confirmed on Tuesday, CSE is able to support and help the CAF on cybersecurity and cyber defense issues. When doing so, they take on Canadian Armed Forces mandates, meaning that if the CSE were required to be called upon in a conflict, particularly a war, that would mean CSE civilians that are assisting the Canadian Armed Forces would be considered combatants in a war. And this kind of, you have to contend with and understand to what degree this extends to the rest of the organization as well at that point.
Next, again to Mr. Rudolph. How is the CAF's current reconstitution order affecting the development of its cyber forces?
I can't comment too much on that as the information I have is limited, but I will say that a big reason for the difficulty in retaining those with the skills in the CAF is because they simply don't have the infrastructure or means to actually do the work. There are a lot of bureaucratic walls and just slow procurements that they are joined the forces to do this work, but don't necessarily want to be sent out to just set up radios.
Thank you. And going back to that original article I spoke of, the recent information that you comment on indicates that the CSE and the DND CAF are in the same planning stages towards a similar type of organization, but public information remains limited on a timeline for its creation. Could you speak to the lack of information on the initiative and how it also raises the serious implications for the CSE civilian employees? Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. As much as I can elaborate that, I'm aware that it is a plan, but that's really the most of my knowledge on that. As from the information that I've heard from officials, it seems to be the existing relationship is very much ad hoc, that they have potentially CSE individuals with the CAF embedded or vice versa, but I don't know too much on that because it just doesn't really exist in open sources.
Fair enough. Okay. Last question. With regards to the urgency to solving the aging and failing digital services, what do you think the government has been, or why do you think the government has been slow to address the failing system?
It's been a long problem that, are you referring to just in the CAF or broadly government?
Well, more specifically in the CAF.
In the CAF, okay. It's part of that is the ad hoc process that I referred to, that the creation of Shared Services Canada basically gutted the armed forces of their cybersecurity and cyber talent. That the idea of just centralizing in SSC, good idea, but it overlooks the central importance of national defense and digital capabilities for that. So they have
Unfortunately,
basically...
we're going to have to leave that answer there. I apologize again, insincerely, but still do it. Yeah. Madame Lambropoulos, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you. And I would first like to start by thanking Mr. Rudolph and Mr. Keenan for being here with us to answer some of our questions and for giving us your interesting testimony. I'm going to start with Mr. Rudolph. You spoke about the fact that currently there's no specific way to address cyber conflict. And given that the National Security Act could undergo a statutory review in 2023, do you believe there are any changes that should be considered in the course of this review? How can we strengthen legislation, or rather create legislation and what should we include in that so that we can prepare Canada for potential cyber threats or for cyber warfare?
Thank you for your question. I would say the number one thing that Canada needs to do is to state its position on persistent engagement. Persistent engagement is the U.S. strategy of constantly engaging adversarial elements in cyberspace. So when you hear about Cybercom or NSA conducting offensive attacks in order to arrest or target ransomware operators, this is the type of action under persistent engagement. Canada has said that they voiced certain ways of supporting this, but it's very unclear, and the supports to such actions have been very inconsistent.
Okay. So just to be very, I guess, clearer and more consistent in the way that we deal with those threats. And I guess, Mr. Keenan, what I'm hearing you say is that we are very vulnerable due to our reliance on technology and that there isn't too much that we can do about that. But I'm wondering if there are any suggestions you would make to that same review, the National Security Act, any changes?
Sure. I mean, there's explicitly addressing what we call hackback or active measures. And I did question the Canadian Armed Forces. They directed me to the document Strong, Secure, Engaged. And in there is a little bit of, and Alex probably knows more about this too, there's a spot in there where it does say that with the right level of authorization, we can hack back. Well, the reality is we're going to have to hack back. There's no, it's not really negotiable anymore. Of course, it becomes a definitional question. I was told at one point that the United States government was looking at physical facilities in Russia that might possibly be victims of an attack. Okay, we do know the U.S. government put a virus in printers that went into Iraq and so on. So it's going on out there. I don't think we have a clear policy on it. I think we need to know. And I realize for security reasons, they may not want to be forthcoming about when they actually do it. But it seems to me, from what I've been able to find as a civilian, that they are not clear on when they can use active measures.
All right, thank you. Mr. Rudolph, my next question is for you again, and I'm wondering if you can kind of give us a bit more of an explanation between about the difference between cybersecurity and cyber warfare. At what point does it become cyber warfare, and what are the overlaps between the two?
You have about 10 seconds to answer that question.
I'll try and be quick then, which is difficult for an academic. Cybersecurity is very much holistic, whereas cyber defense and cyber warfare is very targeted about the threats and largely, for the most part, includes states and not non-state actors. Whereas, cybersecurity, you're dealing with low-level criminals as well as states, while cyber defense is targeted just like national defense.
Thank you. Ms. Lambropoulos, 1 minute.
Professor Keenan,
Professor Keenan, we spoke of essential infrastructure. I'm thinking of the electric network and perhaps even electrical vehicles. Do you think that the provinces are sufficiently consulted or engaged in developing protocols in the defense of these infrastructure? And if so, if not, what can we do?
We need to consult the provinces and we need to consult the private sector as well, because so many of those things are in the hands of private companies. I know there are meetings, I know there is collaboration, but the reality is, and I don't want to bring up the balloon again, but people have said, what if there was an electromagnetic pulse weapon in that thing? And it certainly is possible that somebody will do a kind of high-level attack on our critical infrastructure, and that would require all hands on deck. So I agree there should be wider consultation, there should be contingency plans. We wouldn't last very long without our power grid, and that's a fact.
Yeah. Mr. Boulerice, 1 minute, s'il vous plaît.
Wow, 1 minute. Question à monsieur.
Okay, the question will go to Mr. Rudolph. It's quite concerning as to our lack of capacity to hack back. Some private consulting firms, large telecoms, web managers who control our lives. Are you not concerned this sort of incapacity, our dependence vis-a-vis all these private corporations?
I'm not at all, as I think cybersecurity professionals are just as important as members of the military and a police force, that they are sure they can be viewed as a risk in certain senses, but cybersecurity professionals are integral to the functioning of our society. So it would be undue to say that it's entirely a risk, but it's a risk that we have to take into account, as with any organization for that matter.
Thank you, Mr. Boulerice. Mr. Kelly, 4 minutes.
Just taking you back, Mr. Rudolph, to your opening statement in which you said that CAF is in no way prepared for cyber warfare, and you were limited by time then to explain the different ways, but I think that information is important for the committee and the report that we're going to make. So if you could take whatever time I've got here and itemize recommendations that you would have to prepare for the CAF to become prepared. Go ahead.
Thank you for that opportunity. Fortunately, on many of the questions I've been allowed to expand on all of the points many of the points. The one I don't think I've touched on too much yet is a general lack of infrastructure, cyber infrastructure in the forces. That one part, this is just slow procurement process, as many of you will be well aware of, but it's also not incorporating and understanding the unique challenges and differences that cyber is from traditional defense sector. So I'm still very much a novice in defense procurement, I'll preface that with, but I'm very much aware that current ITP policies in many cases fail to capture investments by large, potentially prime contractors in cybersecurity and cyber defense. In addition, that there is the slow process is even more damaging to SMEs working in cyber because they don't have a time to wait 12 or 16 months for an ITQ when they have funding for maybe a year at the most if they're lucky. And especially when you're dealing with AI and a lot of these advanced offensive capabilities, these SMEs need all the support that they can get. And when your only customer is potentially the government and it's going as slow as they can be, Canada isn't necessarily going to be a customer.
So is it fair to say then that Canada's, the PSPC or the government of Canada's procurement processes are prohibitive for a small or medium-sized enterprise? You can't even deal with the bureaucracy, can't deal with the process. Is that correct?
I won't say across the board, but specifically with cyber-oriented SMEs, I would say yes.
Okay. Are we... all right, great. Well, let's give you a minute to talk about CSE then, because you said that neither CAF nor CSE, and you didn't have as much time to elaborate on CSE. So go ahead and in what steps does CSE need to take to get prepared?
I would say CSE is the most prepared, in part as a lot of their planning has been good. A lot of their open reporting on what they've been doing has been fantastic. It's largely the connections between CSE and the CAF that are almost non-existent. It's very informal from what I've been able to learn. That there needs to be an actual formal command structure in place to mediate what happens in the event of a conflict. As right now, what is likely to occur, it's going to be given to CSE to respond in an active cyber threat. And I believe that there are more formal connections and relations between CSE and global affairs than there are between the CAF and CSE.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Ms. O'Connell, 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I just want to actually continue on this line of questioning a little bit and some answers, Mr. Rudolph, from earlier. You spoke of, I just want clarification, you spoke about transparency, and I wasn't quite sure if you were referring to transparency in policy or the details of these relationships. You talked about something about, databases, and they're all separate databases. Are you talking about the policy around these mechanisms or the details themselves?
I would say both. As the ad hoc policy that I referred to was very much new policy every year, or finding that, our policy last year didn't work, let's do something new, that there really isn't much coherency and logic through the years.
Sorry, I'm just limited on time. So I guess I can see from an academic's perspective, but you'd also have to, I would think, appreciate that when it comes to national security and certainly around cyber, that there is a policy around need to know basis as well. So from, a transparency of policy, I can totally understand like that needs to be out there in open source. But in details or databases, I could also see why you would have multiple databases, because not everybody who has security clearance is on a need-to-know basis for every database. And then if you use the example of Dr. Keenan about cyber attacks, malware attacks, could you not see the benefit, maybe not from a researcher's perspective, but the benefit in silos? And I can't believe I'm saying this because I spent many years on finance trying to break down silos between governments or between government departments. But when it comes to actual cyber information, that having a need-to-know basis and not having it like that balance between having it in the public open source networks, but open source also means our adversaries also access that information. So I can understand from a research perspective, but don't you think that there is a very real necessary reason to limit some access to the details of how CSE works with CAF and how CAF works with other departments? Do you see the nature of the security risk if that was all in open source?
I would agree on principle, but I would caution against painting as black and white in that sense, as there are varying levels to this, just as there are varying levels to security clearance. But the problem is that these silos are existing without much thought to if they need to be silos in the first place, and to what degree that these silos are being detrimental to the actual productive work of the armed forces.
Do you have any examples so that we can delve into that a little bit deeper?
As the specifics on the databases in question, that is definitely separate from the policy. It's the ad hoc nature is very much overall, but the policy that I would really put my finger on that needs to be clarified is CAF's position and strategy related to persistent engagement.
Persistent engagement of what?
Persistent engagement, the U.S. strategy of how to respond to adversarial states in cyberspace.
Okay, thank you.
Unfortunately, I have to draw this meeting to a close. As you can see from the last 3 or 4 questions, we're starting to get to the meat of the issues, particularly the CSE's relationship to CAF and the relationship it has with global and with public safety, et cetera, et cetera. It's a bit of it's silos. We hope it's not entirely silos, because security is security is security. And also the persistent engagement issue calls into question CSE's ability to conduct in Canada those kinds of operations. So I would invite you on behalf of the committee to submit any other thoughts, any written thoughts that you have, because we're going to have to try and arrive at some sort of policy recommendation. And I appreciate both of you making yourselves available today to engage the committee in this very challenging conversation. So with that, colleagues, we will suspend and re-empanel. And again, I thank Mr. Rudolph and Dr. Keenan, particularly Dr. Keenan, for getting up a couple hours early. Yeah, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
ask Kristen Chenke and Alex Rappin to make their 5-minute presentations, I think we should take note that our friend and colleague James Bazan is not with us today, and the reason for that is that his grandson had open heart surgery yesterday. I'm given to understand that the baby is doing well, but for those of you who know James well, a note would be in order. Given the Laval incident, our guts all turn when it comes to our kids and our grandkids, mine particularly, because I've got a few grandkids. So, as I say, for those of you who can, send James a note. So, with that, I'm going to call on Ms. Chenke first for 5 minutes, and then Mr. Rappin for 5 minutes after that. So, please.
Good morning, Chair, Vice Chairs, members of the committee, and the other witnesses on this panel. I'm honored to be invited, and I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence reaches back to time immemorial and continues today. This land acknowledgement is meaningful to me as a commitment towards reconciliation practices and recognizing our relationship to place and identity. My name is Kristen Chenke, and I'm speaking to you as a PhD candidate or all but dissertation at the Balsillie School of International Affairs through Wilfrid Laurier University. My research focuses on cyber governance and the management of emerging technologies in Canada. I have the honor of being called by the committee to speak on the study topics of cybersecurity and cyber warfare. My approach to these topics comes from my personal capacity as a researcher and academic focusing on the governance side of cybersecurity. I have written on issues of relevance to the study topics, including threats associated with cybersecurity, the roles and responsibilities of involved actors, and the intersections with conflict. It is through my research and previous publications that I approach these topics. In my opening statement, I will focus my remarks on 2 main points that I think may benefit the committee in their study. These 2 main points are, first, that the threats associated with cybersecurity are dynamic, and second, that preparing to address these threats requires coordination and cooperation among diverse actors. Let me elaborate on each of these points for the committee. When I say dynamic, I mean that cybersecurity is complex, constantly changing, and involves multiple actors, contexts, and ideas. This is because cybersecurity is an interconnected social, political, and technical endeavor where humans and technologies are intertwined. We live in a cyber-physical world where many aspects of our lives occur in digital spaces with physical linkages. Therefore, threats associated with cybersecurity should include a nuanced understanding of the technological capacity and capability, but also of the role of human actors, especially in interpreting threats and the responses to said threats. This leads me to my second point, that preparing to address the threats associated with cybersecurity requires coordination and cooperation. If we are to speak about the evolving nature of threats associated with cybersecurity, including technological capabilities and capacities of various actors, then we also must speak of how to address them. This point may seem straightforward, but is not always this way in practice. I'll provide an example for the committee. In a recent journal article, my co-author and I looked at how differing cooperating states understand the quantum threat. The quantum threat is a specific cybersecurity threat associated with the capabilities of quantum computers. Among the Five Eyes partners, we found differences in how this threat, the associated technology, its users' intentions, and the potential threat actors were understood in policies. Discrepancies in understanding the threats associated with cybersecurity will have an impact on how the roles and responsibilities of actors involved in addressing these threats. Coordination between diverse actors involved in interconnected political, social, and the technical aspects of cybersecurity must occur. This could take shape by leveraging existing pathways and expertise beyond a single contextual understanding of the threat. This requires cooperation. Cooperation is a key part of addressing cybersecurity threats and keeping Canada safe. Canada can leverage existing trusted partnerships to coordinate responses to address threats that appreciates the dynamicism of cybersecurity. This could mean fostering informal or formal engagement with other like-minded high-tech allies to holistically define threats, understand the associated technological capability and capacity, and the complex human technical dimensions of cybersecurity. Prioritizing innovative partnerships may help ensure security, as well as protect and promote Canadian interests abroad. It is through cooperation and coordination where Canada can work to ensure that we remain safe and secure in an already complex cyber-physical world. I look forward to discussing any ideas and issues raised in the course of my statement during the question period. This concludes my statement. Thank you for your kind attention.
Ms. Chenke, Mr. Rappin, 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I am a research fellow at the Raoul Dandurand Chair of Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of Quebec in Montreal. And my research focuses on issues related to cyber strategy, cyber defense, and more generally on the impacts of information technology on international security. In 2020, the research team I'm part of launched a database dedicated to publicly record geopolitical cyber incidents targeting Canada, whether it be its government entities, its companies, its research institutions, or its civil society. Our feeling at the time was that geopolitical cyber incidents in Canada were quick to make headlines, but even quicker to be forgotten. We felt that the Canadian public was not fully equipped to grasp the full, cumulative, and pervasive character of foreign cyber operations targeting Canada. Thus, we set up an online, freely accessible directory of geopolitical cyber incidents aimed at documenting publicly recorded incidents, their nature, their targets, and, when possible, their initiators. The aim of this database was also to keep score of foreign cyber activities targeting Canada, so as to provide the public with a barometer of this phenomenon. 3 years later, as of today, our database has recorded 93 geopolitical cyber incidents in Canada since 2010. Among those, 14 incidents took place in 2022 alone. We observe, in fact, that the frequency of such incidents is clearly increasing. And as I mentioned, our work is based only on publicly recorded incidents, which means that many more incidents remain unreported to this day.
These 93 incidents include different type of malicious activity, economic espionage against enterprises and Canadian universities, electronic surveillance of activists and NGOs based in Canada, and collecting information and intel on organizations which are governmental in character. Our data indicates that the great majority of these incidents come from 4 countries only: China, Russia, Iran, and DPRK. It's not always certain that these countries are specifically responsible for this or that event, but they do pose a major threat to Canadian security. In 2021 and 22, we published annual reports summarizing the principal observations about these cyber incidents. This, of course, to highlight certain trends and that would be critical for security in Canada.
Focused on the following trends. The growing threat of ransomware cyber attacks against Canadian entities, sometimes state-sponsored, which may disrupt critical infrastructure or serve as cover for clandestine intelligence collection. The increasingly aggressive targeting of Canadian-based activists, exiles, and dissenters by foreign powers for purposes of espionage, intimidation, and harassment. And the rise of the cyber mercenaries industry, which is starting to target Canadian entities, most probably at the request of foreign powers. Needless to say, these 3 trends do not represent the whole picture of cyber threats that Canada is currently facing. The conflict in Ukraine, or the constant economic espionage against Canadian research and development, for instance, should also get our close attention. What I try to demonstrate with these facts, however, is that cybersecurity issues are not a futuristic, hypothetical, distant threat for Canada. Cyber threats are already here with us, and while they may appear discrete or intangible, they directly impact the lives of many people in Canada every day. Hence, I think it is urgent to address these issues more vigorously and also to discuss them more publicly and more frankly. Today's hearing is an excellent opportunity to do so, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rappin. Mr. Calkin, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today's been very enlightening. I guess the first question I'll have for either witness is, if there was an all-out coordinated attack, cyber attack, on Canada by all of the rogue actors in the world, can Canada protect itself? Will our critical systems fail?
I can answer that. I would say that right now, the Government of Canada, through the various departments who are tasked with protecting Canadians and Canadian critical infrastructure, are doing the best job that they can. I think there's always room for improvement, especially when it comes to first of all, reporting cyber attacks. I think right now it's not mandatory to report major cyber attacks. And I think that if, especially for SMEs or other companies or companies in that category, to have a mandatory reporting for cyber attacks would help us understand the breadth of the situation, and I think also provide us with more information so that we can probably come up with a better threat assessment, risk assessment, and come up with frameworks in order to better protect certain industries, certain private sector companies. So I think right now the government is doing the best that it can. We can always do more, and I think part of doing more is mandatory reporting of major cyber attacks.
Je vais répondre en français si vous me permettez.
I will reply in French. On the issue of critical infrastructure, well, the risk is quite high, a very significant risk. They are essential, critical infrastructure. Therefore, any attack on these infrastructure would be high-level risk. High risk, low probability. High risk, of course, because we really should be preparing for the potential that it were to occur, but still realize that it is low probability. There is a risk if we afford too much focus on infrastructure, critical infrastructure only. They're not very probable, but we may not ever see one in Canada. None have yet occurred. Yet many other cyber attacks of a lesser nature have significant consequences nonetheless, cumulatively. And these occur on a daily basis. And this draws our attention, or should draw our attention much more. It is a problem. The critical infrastructure challenge is extremely high profile. You can't really draw any clear lines as to where the cutoff would be as to a rigorous counterattack or defense. But all these minor, if I may say, cyber attacks which occur on a daily basis are not considered serious enough to give it a concerted effort, but cumulatively they produce as much damage as anything else. So I don't think we really have any good strategy or position on these smaller events to, in fact, prohibit them.
The mere fact that we're not an important enough target as a nation, that our government and that our critical infrastructure is not an important enough target. However, we are involved in organizations like NATO. I believe that the increase that we're seeing is a direct result of our involvement in supplying Ukraine with defensive assets Would you agree that that because of our involvement with Ukraine, we are exposing ourselves to risk? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't involve ourselves with Ukraine, but are other actors right now using this as cover to probe our defenses?
Je pense qu'en termes comparatifs,
On a comparative basis, I don't think that Canada is a priority target for either Russia or the other opponents in the cyber world. We don't present a high enough risk or danger to the Russians right now. So it would be the countries that are neighboring Ukraine that would be targeted. Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, Poland, from what I can obtain from open source and in publicly available information. And I believe that if Russia had in mind to punish Canada by releasing their criminal element to go out and get more ransomware from Canada or create a rift between Canada and the U.S. by leaking information. From what I've seen, I don't get the information that...
Mr. Gawkins. Mr. May, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I was delighted to hear Ms. Jenke, you're from Balsillie School. I know it very well, being from Waterloo Region myself. I know that ecosystem and some of the amazing work that's coming out of there. In fact, just a few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of joining Minister Champagne at the Perimeter Institute, which is just around the corner. And launching Canada's quantum strategy. And much of what was discussed there, I have to admit, went in completely over my head. But I recognize the amazing work that's being done there. On that note, how are advancements in artificial intelligence and quantum technology changing the cyber threat environment for Canada?
Mr. Chair, thank you so much for that question from Mr. May. I would say that there are certain technologies, we can call them disruptive, we can call them emerging technologies, that sometimes we will think of them as they themselves being a threat, or they themselves being very disruptive and can have huge impacts on as related to cybersecurity issues. But how I sort of see this problem or this concept is that technologies also interact with humans. Humans create the technologies. We work with them, and we can use them for a variety of purposes. So when we think about, for example, quantum computers have the potential to benefit many fields, and so it's not just from a defense perspective that we can look at it. We can also look at the benefits in, for example, accelerating artificial intelligence, for improving simulations, for a variety of other purposes, including weather predictions, etc. And so I think when it comes to talking about and investing in and developing certain technologies with the intention of developing capabilities for Canada, I think we have an expert base in this country in a variety of regional hubs that are doing excellent work. But I think what needs to happen is that there needs to be more cooperation to address the threats that we associated with the use of these particular technologies, and also keeping in mind that it's not just the technology that's the threat. It's the potential for certain malicious actors to use these certain technologies in a way that could cause harm. And one of the ways in which we can help cooperate to address these threats is through leveraging these existing partnerships. So that's leveraging existing partnerships at home in Canada between government and industry and academia through the various research centers that we have dedicated to these particular type of technologies, but also leveraging existing pathways for partnership amongst our allies.
And Monsieur, do you have anything you'd like to add with regard to that? No. Okay. You covered it well, I suppose. In terms of maybe the concept of mass adoption of emerging technologies among Canadians, which trends present the greatest cybersecurity risks in your opinion? And we'll start with you, sir.
En matière de technologie, particulièrement de nouvelles technologies d'innovation?
Newer technologies, more recent technologies?
In terms of things like smart vehicles, wearable tech, that kind of thing, are there specific areas that we should be concerned about that might be vulnerable to cyber attack?
Je pense.
Well, I couldn't give you any ranking or priority, which is the more serious threat, but what draws my attention particularly, personally, is the Internet of Things, of objects, the interconnection that all these have. There's a proliferation of these objects and exponential in growth. What it represents for Canada, I think, is that the surface on which an attack could be produced is a lot more wide. You can use any doorway to get into the whole system, any number of appliances. These are the weak link in the chain, if you will, small objects that were designed for convenience. They're inexpensive. They're easy to use. But what the designers have sacrificed, of course, is security. I think we have to really reflect on various standards that should perhaps be applied to these connected appliances and devices. In the very near future, these are going to be the gateway of choice for very important breaches.
Monsieur Garon, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thanks to our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Rapin, I'll begin with you. I'd like to know if, in regards to cybersecurity discussions, if Canada is a credible ally, the Five Eyes, for example. Where do we stand? The exchange of information which occurs, is it give and take? I mean, do we get enough back, or are we productive enough? Can we offer enough information to get sufficient information back? Well, it's quite clear that Five Eyes is a bit of a casino, a bit of a jackpot. Well, yes, but we do a lot of cooking here, so it's potluck. Unfortunately, I'm not privy to anything that goes on within the Five Eyes. I have no insider information whatsoever. But from an outsider's perspective, for many researchers, individuals who are working in this field, Canada is not seen as a heavyweight at the table, if you will. It's perhaps a bit blunt, but that's the general optic. No, we understand the nuance there, and it's all very good to mention it. I have noted that Canada is very slow in taking some strategic decisions, particularly recently. Well, there was Huawei, of course, well known, but there were others. And did this not perhaps hinder and damage our credibility within our allies group and change perhaps the perception that our allies may have of us? Well, Canada didn't come out smelling roses in this case, but we should have taken perhaps a more firm stance a little earlier and stick by it. There's a lot of externalities that come into play also. It's a complicated situation. What I gather from some international colleagues is Canada has an image of being a gentle and kind society. You know, national security, yes, but would you say perhaps a little naive? No, I wouldn't say naive, not at all. No, that's not what we hear. It's not what I gather. But perhaps a certain maturity vis-a-vis national security issues. We're not always prepared to deal with the issue head-on. All right. I'll change orientation a little bit here. You know that the McKinsey consulting firm, hundreds of millions in contracts, specifically with DND, but they're not particularly known for their ethical high standards. Deals with China a lot. It's part of its new market, and for the last few years. Do Canadians, do Quebecois have reason to be concerned about leakage or sharing of information? Should there not be greater transparency policies in our relationship with some of these countries, more detailed? Well, I'm in no position at all to answer that question. Okay, understood. And Ms. Chenke, excuse me if I mispronounce your name, but you spoke of the quantum computer as a threat, as a risk. In a lot of circumstances, we have a lot of vulnerabilities on cyber attack, but the human factor is central to that. You know, social engineering, etc. Apart from the investments that we're making in our infrastructure, our physical infrastructure, is Canada doing enough to ensure that the risks associated with the human factor be minimized or contained as best possible?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank Monsieur Garon for the question. I'd also like to pick up on a question that you posed earlier about Canada's role in the Five Eyes, and then I'll get to your other question. So the Five Eyes, as we know, are an important and trusted intelligence sharing partnership, and this partnership could extend to information relating to cybersecurity. As I mentioned in my opening statement, in a recent co-author paper that I wrote, we found that the specific cyber security threats are understood differently between these cooperating allies, especially in the Five Eyes. And when it comes to working on solving these particular cybersecurity-related issues, I think perhaps one option for Canada to really lead, or an opportunity for Canada to really lead on this issue area within the Five Eyes, would be on addressing, understanding certain cybersecurity issues such as the quantum threat. And perhaps this could be through a Five Eyes quantum consortium. This is understanding that the Five Eyes is an intelligence and information sharing partnership, but we've seen and that's its primary purpose, but we've seen in other partnerships between allies, such as with AUKUS, that there can be secondary purposes that might allow us to align and cooperate on particular issues. So we know that.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave the answer there. I'm sure you'll have an opportunity to elaborate further. Mr. Boulderies. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks for the witnesses for their appearances today. Very important discussion. My first question to Ms. Jenke. In 2021, I believe you published Selling Simulations, the Seduction of Cold War, Fetishism in a Post-Cyber World. Long title. Could you provide this article to the committee so that we can put it in the record of this committee? And how would that analysis apply today with the conflicts that we're seeing today between ourselves, China, and Russia?
I would be happy to provide that for the committee. So in incorporating some of the arguments that I made in that particular paper that was referenced by the committee member, would be that when we're thinking about technology and when we're thinking about cyber threats, it's often caught up in a narrative that excludes human actors and human intentions and ideas about certain technologies and certain capabilities from the lived experience and reality of what cybersecurity is, which is that complex socio-technical system. And if we see cybersecurity threats and that interconnection with humans and technologies, we can also add in services, people, private sector businesses, and other connected technologies that flow between different sectors. And so what I would really like to emphasize is that when we're talking about connected technologies, and we're associating it with, for example, critical infrastructure, it's a more dynamic understanding of what cybersecurity issues as related to critical infrastructure. So it's that combination of people, it's a combination of services, it's a combination of private operators and those technologies that flow between. So also picking up on something was mentioned earlier in the earlier session is that we can't really think of cybersecurity issues as a siloed issue, and that this goes between different prerogatives of defense, yes, but also of national security. Also, there's that economic component as well. And I think when we're talking about cybersecurity issues and we're linking it to technologies and people and services, et cetera, we need to understand that there are cybersecurity considerations for each particular sector. And there are different services that are provided within each sector. There's different technologies, again, appreciating the linkages between them. So we can also appreciate that there are different threats, different vulnerabilities, and different risks for each sector. But there are differences and commonalities in between. So I think when we're talking about what cybersecurity problems are, then we also need to think about cybersecurity solutions, and it's not an across-the-board answer for all.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Rapin, vous avez parlé de l'impact.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rapin. You talked of the concrete impact on individuals. We had a disruption of service from Rogers. It wasn't an attack. It was a breakdown in the system. But people were completely unarmed. They were looking, they were trying to get in touch with people. The phones didn't work. The Google Map didn't work. When a telecom of that size, and there were no consequences, there was no sanctions, there was no critique, were very, very vulnerable to a handful of private companies. What do you say?
Je pense.
Well, I can't really comment on the link between the concentration within the telecom industry and the vulnerability of our infrastructure, but I have the impression that what will become increasingly more important will be the redundance of this infrastructure. Well, what we have to do is have backup systems and build in some redundancy, regardless of how many stakeholders, participants, producers are involved. Resilience, in other words. Has thought been given to what would happen if there was an attack here, a true attack on our infrastructure? I have the feeling that this is probably the starting point for improvement. Do you think that the federal government has a particular responsibility to develop standards or directives for redundancies in systems to reduce the risk? Well, yes, I think it's a very reasonable concept. In the United States, since the Colonial Pipeline incident, for example, a great thought has been given to building in redundancies. And we've seen, well, it was an incident that, first of all, in theory, on paper, could have looked like any other ransomware attack, but the consequence, it would have colossal, because once you target a certain link in the supply chain, the consequences are completely disproportionate. And I think we really have to give serious thought to that issue.
These colleagues, again, were in the same situation we were last, and this time we have to have a hard stop at 11:15. So 331133. With that, Ms. Gallant.
Okay, July 8th, we had the Rogers outage that was mentioned. The 9/11 system went down in the Maritimes last week. 2 weeks ago, there was the Canada Transport Civil Aviation NOTAM failure on the heels of the FAA outage. Should the government be compelled to alert the public when a cyber attack is underway on a major system? Now, they didn't tell us about the balloon when it was overhead, so, why would we believe that they'd even tell us that there was a cyber attack underway?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair. What I would pose here is that when you talk about cybersecurity issues that become major cybersecurity threats, I think we have to back it up a little bit too and understand that cyber literacy is a major issue for a lot of businesses and for a lot of people as well. And when we have cyber incident reporting, that's good, but we need to sort of back it up and go from the start. So we need to ensure that there are cybersecurity considerations for particular projects, for particular...
Mr. Chairman, she's not answering the question, so let's go to Mr. Rappin. Should the public be made aware when there's a cyber attack underway on our major systems in Canada?
Je vais répondre en français si vous me permettez.
I'll reply in French if you'll allow. My very personal opinion would be yes, there should be much more transparency. As researchers, of course, we have a bit of a prejudice on that because we like to have access to as much information as we can for our research. But there is also the public interest that has to be served with this transparency. What we have observed that individuals are not particularly worried, but they are concerned. When we have an incident of this type, people are, first of all, they're completely upset because of what's going on. They've lost access to services. And but the system is rather weak. We don't have too much information to provide in most cases as it is, but it would be very beneficial for all if we could have greater transparency.
For an entity to realize that their system is under attack versus dealing with a software glitch?
Je pourrais pas vous donner de...
I couldn't really give you a specific on that.
Yet experience a totally debilitating cyber attack. Can you tell the committee what that would look like? Full-on attack.
15 seconds.
L'exemple qui revient très souvent serait une cyberattaque contre le réseau électrique.
The example would be against the electrical network, the grid. That would cause a lot of damage in Ukraine in 2014 to 16, somewhere in there. Tens of thousands of people had no access to any electricity for many hours. The Canadian grid, electrical grid, is even more vulnerable.
And maybe there's a possibility you could, if you had an opportunity to write a response, would be maybe a way to handle that. With that, Mr. Souza, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So yourselves and the previous testimonies talk about what seems to be a worldwide threat. This is not just Canada. We talk about the Five Eyes and the partnerships that we're trying to engage with other states to try to protect ourselves, to protect the world, in essence. And it affects our supply chains and ways of business, not just politics and elections, and not just defense. There's a real economic consequence of some of these issues. And we heard also about silos and how there seems to be silos within Canada, but there is greater cooperation that's being developed. But there's also silos around the world, even with the Five Eyes, because you yourself have mentioned that you don't know all the issues. So how do we then provide cooperation between other states without, and at the same time, protecting our own national security, right? We don't want to divulge too much information. And I am also concerned about the cognitive warfare, fake news, these other incidences that take place to disrupt our way of life and our democracy. So my question, and I've heard a lot of solutions and no solutions. That seems to be the answer. There's very little that we can do because we're still trying to learn and keep up. So we heard a question about they don't tell us. This big brother, this matrix that exists. Who is they?
Quand moi j'évoquais le...
Well, when I speak of the concept of transparency, it can involve a number of different entities and levels of government. The Canadian government, federal government could be more transparent. Global Affairs Canada, for example, had a major incident a little while ago. Sources have led me to believe that Russian interests were behind that one. But the government is very reticent as perhaps taking a position that it was the Russians. Perhaps the public would...
What I'm hearing is what we're always hearing. There's a number of groups that are responsible. They're trying to cooperate to find a solution, at the same time protecting our national security. So how do we provide the solutions that you're talking about in regards to silos, where we are aware that there is discussions, but that notion of transparency without divulging national security issues, even with other states, even with beyond the Five Eyes?
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question from Mr. Souza. There's a lot of content there, so I'm going to try to be as quick as possible. I would say that, number one, attributions are difficult at the best of times to identify cybersecurity attacks, the motivations, the individuals or groups or states responsible for these attacks. So that does make it difficult. For example, it could be a cyber criminal group who is attacking a certain target for the purposes of profit. It could be a group that is working on behalf
I
of the...
apologize again, Ms. Chinky, but I'm going to have to cut off Mr. Souza. Poor old Mr. Souza. Yeah. Minute, Mr. Guerrero.
Quite quickly, Mr. Hapa. Thank you very much, Ms. Chinky. You can also send us a written response, if you will, to the previous question. However, is diplomacy still a viable option in our dealings with China, or do we have to move to preventative measures? Well, I'm not sure I'll answer your question as you would wish. In the United States, I believe the Americans took notice of the economic espionage of China conducting much earlier than we. And they did try a diplomatic approach. We had Secretary of State visit China, and they tried to discuss the issue. From the results It seemed that it worked perhaps initially for a year. There was a reduction in economic espionage on the part of China until it led to another crisis. And then, of course, it picked up again. I'm not saying that to say that diplomatic approaches and channels are well, it's not adequate. It does have limits. It depends on the circumstances.
Une minute, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Monsieur Rapin,
Thank you. Mr. Rapin, I was a bit concerned when you said 93 publicly declared since 2010 with a rising trend upwards. Well, it's not too surprising from Russia and DPRK. They are always collecting intel. Do these cyber attacks target public infrastructure or government departments and agencies or the private economy, the private sector, banks, for example, and to gather information on the simple citizen? Well, it's very hard to distinguish the categories, if you will, because we only use open source information, publicly available. And the nature of which entities are attacked or the targets is not clear. We use reports from cybersecurity firms. They say Canadian enterprises were targeted. We don't know if that's 1, 5, or many. If they are private sector organizations or government-based.
Mr. Kelly, 3 minutes.
I want to continue on talking about the 93 specific incidents that you've recorded since 2010. You said that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are the primary, or perhaps all 93 of them can be attributed to those four countries. You talked about economic espionage, but you also talked about the surveillance of activists. Do I take it from that you're talking about dissidents in Canada, diaspora communities? You talked about about a number of people that are affected. Can you tell me how many Canadians would be victim of these kinds of attacks or the targets of these attacks? And give us more information on how these geopolitical cyber incidents affect individual Canadians and what sort of harm are caused by these incidents.
C'est difficile à chiffrer.
It's very difficult to quantify because it can take many different forms and different levels of aggressiveness in the attack, depending on who the target is or what the target is. The Uyghurs, for example, could be dealt with rather aggressively by China. In other cases, as we've seen in last December, there was a hack attack by China. The level of involvement, depending on the target, does vary, and so does the intensity of the attack. One might, we gathered 3 countries that up to today were targeting dissidents, activists in Canada, in their diaspora. Saudi Arabia targeted an individual here in Canada. It was reported by Citizen Lab at the time. Then China, who are all constantly putting pressure on the Uyghurs. And then the women's movement in Iran. A certain number of activities. We suspect that Iran is doing some electronic surveillance on its diaspora.
With respect to China and the cyber, the use of cyber incidents against the Chinese diaspora in Canada and their citizens and Canadian citizens, are Beijing's diplomatic offices in Canada involved in these attacks? Is this coming strictly from outside, or is this with cooperation of their diplomatic missions in Canada?
Malheureusement, moi je dispose pas du.
Unfortunately, I don't have information of that nature.
Ms. O'Connell, 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for appearing today. Mr. Repen, I wanted to talk about the differences in your database. I find very interesting, but the differences between, an attack, for example. It's my understanding it's pretty cheap on the dark web to be able to purchase some sort of malware or program, and that sort of blackmail type attack on a business might not even be linked to a foreign adversary, for example. So there's that distinction. Then there's distinction between an attack on a government agency, for example, or department. And then there's a distinction between private entities. And in the course of this study, we would be looking for recommendations for sure to improve our systems. One of the areas of issue is that there is no ability for CSEs, CSIS, our cyber community to actually intervene with private entities, even if they have been attacked by a foreign actor. And that also goes, in some cases, for critical infrastructure. A lot of times municipalities would be the ones owning that infrastructure. And in fact, the CSIS Act directly prevents CSIS from communicating or sharing information with municipalities, provinces, etc. So could you maybe speak to the differences and maybe some recommendations on how we can make sure we're distinguishing between attacks from, let's say, just a bad actor versus a bad foreign actor and the various levels?
Quite rightly, you've identified a number of various perspectives and axes of action. We can't have the RCMP or CSE or CSIS be the sole interveners here. A lot of the infrastructure, as you correctly identified, even essential, are not federal. There's less expertise, perhaps, to ensure the security of those infrastructures. In the United States, we've witnessed that hack groups specifically targeted municipal infrastructure in the States because they realized that the defenses, cyber defenses, were much weaker. So there are different levels and different gateways and approaches that have to be looked at. Christine mentioned earlier that if we could have organizations who are responsible for critical infrastructure would have to mandatorily report critical attacks. I think many legislative authorities are starting to look at that issue seriously now, and I think we should follow through quickly.
I want to thank both witnesses on behalf of the committee. This is, as you can see, a hot topic and a very complex topic. I take note that in this morning's news, Elon Musk's group is cutting off Ukrainian access to the information provided through that satellite. That strikes me as an immense security risk, a clear and present danger to the prosecution of that war. So in the event that you have any thoughts along those lines, I particularly would be interested. But regardless, I do unfortunately have to bring this meeting to a close. With that, colleagues, the meeting is adjourned, and thank you once again.